Inequality is unfair. I happen to agree that it is unfair. The conception of fairness I would offer to explain why it's unfair is a little different from the standard one, but set that to one side. The real problem with inequality is that it's inefficient. All the income gains are being used to buy bigger mansions, more expensive, heavier cars, more expensive wedding receptions, all of those things, when they cascade down and everybody's doing them, don't produce any gains at all in health, well-being, or other measures of human satisfaction. That's money that's just flushed down the toilet.
So welcome to the 25th episode of the Mindful Wealth podcast. Today, Terrie and I are speaking with Professor Robert H. Frank, the Henrietta Johnson Lewis Professor of Management and a Professor of Economics at the Samuel Curtis Johnson School of Management at Cornell University. He contributes to the Economic View column at the New York Times, and he's written and spoken broadly and deeply on the topic of wealth inequality in the United States. Robert, welcome to the Mindful Wealth podcast.
Jonathan, nice to see you.
So, Robert, when I invited you on the show, I promised the impossible that we were going to cover the last 3 decades of your work. Obviously, we can't really cover everything, but before we dig into specifics, would you give us kind of the arc, starting with the presciently named book, The Winner-Take-All Society, 1995? That's a long time ago. It seems like we're moving more towards that.
Yeah, that was a book that I co-wrote with a longtime close friend, Philip Cook. He was a graduate school classmate of mine at Berkeley, and it started out with an invitation he got to do a paper on why the best students from around the country were getting more and more concentrated into the elite universities. He and I are test cases for this paper. He graduated from the University of Michigan in '68. I graduated from Georgia Tech in '66, both state schools, good schools, but not the elite schools on the list that most people look to today. Neither he nor I even applied to any of the Ivy League schools or other elite schools like Stanford or MIT or Caltech. That wasn't on our radar screen even. Today, and even when we were writing this paper in the late '80s, students with high school records like ours would have applied to many schools on that elite list, and if they'd gotten accepted to any of them, they would have gone almost for sure. So why did that change happen? And it was a really interesting exercise thinking about the forces that led people to change their minds about where to go. There are a lot of different things, of course. But rising inequality was a big contributor. The payoffs to entry-level jobs in certain fields were so great that the recruiters for those firms got mail sacks full of applications. They couldn't possibly look at them all. Who'd they talk to? They threw out all the ones that weren't from elite schools. And so the premium to having a degree like that would get you in the door became much, much greater. And from there, it continued. Yeah, it was a wonderfully stimulating project to work on. It's not a new idea, actually. This has been going on ever since the dawn of the industrial age. It used to be that pianos, of course, are very heavy, and it was so difficult and costly to ship them that virtually every piano produced in the world was sold to somebody within a relatively few miles of the factory where it was made. Now, the pianos are made in only a handful of locations worldwide. It's very cheap to ship them. The whole industry has consolidated into a handful of firms. And that's a good thing in a sense for consumers, because you'd rather buy the pianos made by the very best producers. But there has been an enormous increase in inequality as a result of that. And as well, we reflected on the idea of what it takes to get to be the best. There's an enormous dogfight, and some of the effort that goes into that is productive, but a lot of it is purely wasteful, as in the quest for getting to an elite school. You've got parents spending large sums of money and students spending endless hours on SAT test prep, that's a completely socially useless activity. Privately, it's useful. It helps you get in. If you do it and the others don't, you look good relative to them. If they do it and you don't, then you look bad relative to them. If you all do it, it's a waste.
I'm not going to tell my son that you said that.
Well, if you gave him the whole explanation, he would realize why it was in his interest to do it, even though it's not in everyone's interest that it happened.
Right.
Yeah, that's one of the big themes in my work, which is that what it's rational for the individual to do is often completely senseless if we all do it. We all stand up to see better. Nobody sees any better than if everybody had remained comfortably seated.
Wow, that's so fascinating. And it's a perfect segue into the next question, which is, so Robert, on the Mindful Wealth podcast, we're concerned with how social structures impact individual outcomes. And so before we dig into the specific issues of your work, maybe you can just tell us what you see as true life success on an individual level.
I think I have a more idiosyncratic view of that than many people do. There's Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, his name's very difficult to pronounce. That was my best effort at it. Died recently, but he was the psychologist who identified the psychological state called flow. It's when you're deeply immersed in something to the extent that you're completely unaware that the hours are going by. There's no other long duration state of mind that's more satisfying than that, the state of flow. And I think if you can find a way to organize your life so you experience that state for extended periods of time, that's really the most you can hope for. I've been incredibly lucky. I describe the long sequence of chance events. If any one of which hadn't happened, I wouldn't have been able to hold the position I did at Cornell for many decades and had the chance to think about the ideas that I've developed or write the books that I've had time to write. Those experiences were for me deep flow experiences. When I'm in the middle of writing a book, the first thing I want to do in the morning is read what I wrote yesterday. I think of ways to make it better. I start tinkering, and then I'm adding to it. And before long, it's time to open a bottle of wine in the evening. If you can find a job that lets you experience that, that's the highest aim, I think.
What do you think the biggest obstacles are to people finding those jobs?
They're too numerous to list. I mean, I got to do what I do by pure dumb luck, really. You can steer yourself so that you'll have a better chance to have a pleasurable experience. What we know is that there's an inverse relationship in the labor market between how much they're willing to pay you and how unpleasant the job is. If the job is boring, if there are bad odors in the place where you work, if it's dangerous, any of those things, people don't like to fill those jobs compared to other jobs that are more attractive. Employers have to offer higher wages than in the more pleasant jobs. The mistake I think too many students make is to take the highest paying job that's on offer. That won't necessarily be the one that they will like the best. And if you don't like your job, you're not going to be able to get to be a real expert at what's entailed in it. There's a big debate amongst the people who study the development of expertise. Does it take 2,000 hours or 10,000 hours? Nobody's sure, but they all agree it takes a long time. And if you're not doing something that you like, you're probably not going to be willing to put in that kind of focus and effort to get to be an expert. And here's where the winner-take-all idea comes in. If you get to be the best at what you do, even if it's a thing that not very many people care about or are willing to pay a lot for, it's so easy to collect the entire world sample of people who care about a thing and steer them to the person who's best at it, that you might make an incredibly good living by being the best at what you do, even if that's not something that's considered widely important or valuable. Maybe you'll stumble onto something that is valuable and you'll get filthy rich. But the very worst outcome, if you go down that path, is you'll end up spending most of your days doing something that's pleasing to you. Now, that may leave you too poor to do some other things that you want to do, but there are workarounds for that too.
So when I was a kid, I came from a very low resource household. As a kid, I'm talking grade school, my goal was to be rich. And when I was in junior high, I refined it. I wanted to be a millionaire. By the time I got to high school, the goal was to be a multimillionaire. I mean, what I saw my friends have stuff and have vacations and their parents drive nice cars and do things that I couldn't do. So I wanted that thing. So I worked with industry and effort and studied hard because I was going to build wealth. I'm wondering if there's room for that ambition. And is that ambition a bad thing? Is it a bad desire for me to say, I want to be wealthy?
No, I don't think it is. There are different ways to use wealth. If all you care about is shiny objects, I think we've got some pretty focused research now that demonstrates, at least to my satisfaction, that there's at best fleeting satisfaction in that. One of my co-authors and friends, Tom Gilovich, has done a series of papers comparing the effect of purchases of what he calls experiences, maybe a hiking trip, maybe a study tour somewhere, as opposed to buying goods or objects. And it's a very robust set of findings he and his collaborators have come up with. People who purchase experiences in the wake of those purchases enjoy a much longer boost in psychological well-being. It's much more durable. They don't tend to compare their experiences unfavorably with the experiences of others, which people often do with goods. And so if you have a chance to think about the things that you devote whatever wealth you're able to come up with on, I think it can be a wonderfully liberating thing. A lot of experiences are pretty expensive.
It's true. That is.
But if you can't afford those, there are many others that are free.
But is there a negative social impact to my having developed wealth? Is that an expense to others?
What I show in a number of works that I've done is that there's one very robust finding in the literature that studies the determinants of human flourishing, and that's that in a wide swath of consumption domains, beyond a certain point, when everybody spends more, there's no meaningful increase in health, happiness, thriving by any measure. It just raises the bar that determines how much people feel they need. I think a good example of that is the trajectory of expenditures on wedding celebrations. In 1980, in real dollars, that was an average in the US of $11,000 in inflation adjusted dollars. By 2018, it was more than 3 times that much. It was $36,000. None of the people getting married in 2018 were any happier because they were spending 3 times as much in real terms. It was just that others were spending that much. And if you spent significantly less than that, then people would go home thinking that you hadn't appreciated what a special day it was. No parent wants to host a party where the guests leave thinking that. And so, of course, you try to put on a good show to honor the bride and groom. But you don't have to spend $36,000 to do that unless everybody else is spending that much.
I want to follow up on it a little bit there, Terrie. it's interesting because I just had an email exchange with a client this morning, and it was about his daughter's like 7, and we're doing some financial planning. And the question was, how much do you want to build in for the wedding? And he said, oh, probably a couple $100,000. And so, and I think you've said in some of your other works about the relative prices of houses. When you have the ultra rich have a very big house, that means the people just underneath them need a little bit bigger house, and the people under them need a bigger house. And it sort of cascades downward. And I thought of this $200,000 going, oh my God, that's a whole lot. But won't that make everyone say, you know what, we need to spend a little bit more on those weddings?
Well, if you ask why is it that the average is 36,000 instead of 11,000, the reason is that others, like the average family, are spending 36,000, but that doesn't answer why they're spending 36,000. And you just put your finger on it. It's the people at the top. They're the ones who've captured almost all of the income gains since 1970. I don't know how rich your client is, but many of them spend much more than $200,000 on their daughter's wedding. The people in the middle don't look at those weddings and say, we got to do that. Of course, they can't do that. But there's a group just below the top. They go to those weddings. Now they need to spend on a bigger orchestra and have it catered from a bigger name restaurant than before, because that's the new standard. And so people who are in their circle come to those weddings, and it cascades all the way down. The median earner in real terms, men at any rate, aren't earning any more per hour than they were in 1970. So they're not spending more because of that. They're spending more because other people are spending more. And others are spending more because people at the top are spending more. Why are they spending more? Because they've gotten all the income gains.
Okay, so it's kind of like a thing that shifts its way up the pyramid.
Exactly. And so people say inequality is unfair. I happen to agree that it is unfair. The conception of fairness I would offer to explain why it's unfair is a little different from the standard one, but set that to one side. The real problem with inequality is that it's inefficient. All the income gains are being used to buy bigger mansions, more expensive, heavier cars, more expensive wedding receptions. All of those things, when they cascade down and everybody's doing them, don't produce any gains at all in health, well-being, or other measures of human satisfaction. It's money that's just flushed down the toilet. And it's not as if there aren't other critically useful things we could be doing with that money. It would be quite easy to shift billions, maybe trillions of dollars to other uses that would actually make a difference in people's lives.
But so that leads me to the question. So we have this issue that, like, let's say on the one hand, there's this kind of an arms race, which is that anybody who cares about something is going to naturally kind of try to get good at it. Then there's the fact that we like map that onto wealth and economics, right? So like, let's say, for me, if I care about achievement, and obviously I care about, building wealth for my family, I also have a background as a competitive athlete. And like, I know what it is to chase after medals. And so there's this kind of personal ambition and the fact that we want to win at whatever game we're playing. And then there's, well-being and, maybe giving back and some of those more social things. How do we map those two things onto each other?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think in so many domains of life, it's not how well you perform in absolute terms, it's how well you perform in relative terms that determines how well you're rewarded. And in athletics, that's certainly true. If you could run a 4-minute mile in 1950 in the men's group, you were a hero. 4-minute mile is a good high school runner now. So when we have competitive endeavors like that, there's a huge incentive on each contestant to try to get better. Some of the steps to get better are more dangerous than others. And so in hockey, one of my economic heroes, Tom Schelling, asked the question, why is it that hockey players skate bareheaded whenever there's no rule requiring helmets? And yet they will vote, often unanimously in a secret ballot, for a rule requiring them to wear helmets. If helmets are so great, he said, why don't you just wear them? Why do you need a rule? And his answer was compelling. It was that if you take your helmet off, you can see better, you can hear better, maybe you can intimidate rival players more effectively because you're crazy enough to skate without a helmet. They'll give you a wider berth on the ice, therefore. You gain an edge, of course, you're at greater risk of injury, but the injury is not certain. If it happens, it's going to be in the future. The edge you get is right now. That's a compelling incentive for the athlete to take the helmet off. But when everybody takes the helmet off, the best response is, of course, for the other side to do the same. Then half the teams win and half the teams lose, just like before. And so much better that everybody wear a helmet and everybody have lower risk of injury and have the same competitive balance you would have had before. So we have all sorts of rules like that to try to limit the steps you can take to gain competitive advantage. You can't, I don't know what sport you were, Terrie, did you take steroids, or were you ever under any pressure to?
Yeah, I was in combat sports, and there was immense, like, I never did dope, but there was like a lot of pressure.
Yeah, there's enormous pressure. And if you know, in the men's 100 meters, Usain Bolt in the World Championships in Beijing in 2015, his winning margin was a tenth of a second. It was a hundredth of a second. If you take steroids, that improves your performance in that sprint by about 2/10 of a second. So if steroids can't be detected, there's no possible way an athlete could win unless he took steroids. So yeah, it's an arms race. We try to regulate it. It's imperfect. The steps we take to keep people from these mutually offsetting investments are not perfect, but they're the best we've got. In the fiscal domain, we've got better tools. It would be a very simple step to tax people at the top more heavily. They don't want to be taxed more heavily. I think the reason they don't want to be taxed more heavily is that they're worried they won't be able to buy the things that make life seem special. Those things are always in short supply. What they don't realize, most of them, is that if they're taxed more heavily, so will the other people they have to outbid to get those same things they want be taxed more heavily. Nobody's relative bidding power will be affected one iota by that. The same penthouse apartments with sweeping views of Central Park end up in the same hands as before. So those dollars that are now being flushed away in bidding wars for things in short supply could instead be used to fund medical research, to come up with investments in green energy and other things that would really make a difference in people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
So there's three things that pop into my head. The first thing is relative to the arms race. If everyone is taxed more and they won't, the relative incomes don't change, then the competition will be who can avoid the tax the most efficiently, right?
They're doing that already. So
yeah, of course.
Yeah, and it pays to invest in the people who try to keep people from avoiding taxes. We have been doing the very opposite of that. We've been cutting the budget of the IRS ever since the early 2010s. What a crazy move. Really? What we know is that human behavior of all sorts is highly contagious. Smoking is very contagious. Eating healthily is contagious. Bicycling is contagious. You see, putting solar panels on your rooftop, that's contagious too. All these things are contagious. Tax cheating is contagious. The estimates that the IRS makes of how much they lose by not having better enforcement take no account of the contagion effect. Everybody wants to do the right thing, or most people do. They see their neighbor cheating and getting away with it. You're a chump if you don't cheat. You feel like, and there are experiments demonstrating that when more of your coworkers cheat, you cheat more too.
Mm-mm. But if I can just sort of come back to the end of that question, which is, so yes, we acknowledge that there's an arm race, and there's you've sort of laid out a way in which one could maybe dismantle some of that economically. But how does that sort of mesh with, individual well-being? Because sometimes these things are a bit at cross purposes, right? Like the more I mortgage, my time, my stress levels, not taking care of myself in the service of attaining some particular external marker, the more I'm kind of going away from my own well-being. But like when we're tempted to always try to outdo the next person, like how can an individual try to balance some of those things?
Yeah, it's when individual interests and group interests are in conflict, as they so often are, it's very difficult for individuals to solve that problem. That's a problem that's best solved by individuals acting collectively. Sometimes you can act collectively on a small private scale. You can form your own groups and adopt norms that are different from what others follow. That can work in some situations, but there was an interesting survey done of associates in law firms. Would you like it if your pay were 10% lower and the number of hours you worked were 10% lower as well? 90% of the people who were surveyed on that question said yes, they would like it. None of them, almost none of them, would do it unless everybody did it. The idea is that if you work less hard than your coworkers, you risk being seen as a shirker. You'll be less likely to be promoted to partner in the law firm. To cut back, everybody needs to cut back. Well, what can we do about that? We've got all sorts of legislation that attempts to rein that in. The Fair Labor Standards Act discourages employers from having you work more than 40 hours a week. They have to pay you time and a half if you work more than 40 hours a week. If you were free to work as many hours a week as you wanted to, you could get ahead of your rivals by working more than they do. And then they would have to work more too. In fields that aren't regulated, mine, for example, in terms of the length of the work week, we see assistant professors driving themselves crazy, working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, because they know that if they publish more papers than their rivals, they'll get promoted. If they publish fewer, they'll get fired. It's very hard to work out those arrangements, but we can make some progress legislatively. I mean, the countries that have use it or lose it vacation, in many countries, you get 4 or 5 weeks a year. If you don't take it, you lose it. And so most people in those countries take the vacation that they're required to take under those rules. And we have studies that show that if everything else is the same, you got one group that gets a week or 2 weeks of vacation, another group that gets 4 or 5. The second group is much, much happier, much healthier. They're even as productive. They restore during vacation time and come back and are more productive. So lots of these things are just low-hanging fruit. We could do a little more by way of copying what the Nordic countries have done, what some other countries have done, and have a little less of this insistence that we see in the American context that whatever the individual wants is sacrosanct. That's fine as long as what the individual wants is consistent with what the group wants, but individuals want to take their helmets off. The group wants people to wear their helmets, and you just have to acknowledge that conflict, and if there are things you can do about it, it's in your interest to do them.
The thing that's the most, this is why I wanted you here, because you're not moralizing. It's very practical. It's just like, and I think that most economics get stuck into two different sides of the aisle. We're going to battle it out. You're just saying, hey, it's better for everybody if we do it this other way. So let's just think it through, make some decisions. So here's the question. What is the single policy that you would change, or that if you wave your hand and it would magically be better? What's the one thing you would do to say, this will make it better for everybody?
Well, we need to come up with a way to finance the public investments that have been underfunded and that we know would make a real difference in people's lives. I mean, in this country, a lot of people don't have adequate access to healthcare. There's just basic things that are missing in people's lives. Supplying them would be costly. The one idea I would push, if I had to push one and only one, would be to adopt a progressive consumption tax. Scrap the progressive income tax that we now have. Instead, replace it with a progressive consumption tax. And it sounds complicated. Oh, I got to save receipts for all my purchases so they can figure out how much I consume. No, you don't have to do any of that. You simply report your income to the IRS as you do now. We could greatly simplify that and should, but set that to one side, report your income. Then document how much you added to your savings during the year. People do that too, many of us, for tax-exempt retirement accounts. The difference between those two numbers, your income minus your savings, that's how much you spent during the year. That amount minus a big standard exemption, maybe $10,000 a person, $12,000 a person, whatever you set it at, is your taxable consumption. If that's a small number, you don't pay any tax. If it grows, you start to pay tax. And the more that number grows, the higher the tax on the next dollar you spend. That's the tax that would blunt the expenditure cascade. It's the expenditures at the very top that are the ones that are driving the wasteful spending in the middle. The fact that now to get a house at the middle of the housing distribution, if you don't get a house priced in the middle of the housing distribution, your kids go to the schools with metal detectors out front. So to blunt that arms race, getting people to spend less at the top is the key step. And very high marginal tax rates on the next dollar spent beyond a certain point is the simplest and most effective way to do that. If somebody has a really compelling reason for adding a $2 million addition to his mansion, fine, go ahead and add it. Instead of costing you $2 million, maybe now it'll cost you $4 million or $6 million. The tax rate can be more than 100% beyond a certain point. It just makes the next thing you spend cost you more than it would have. And people object, oh, well, the rich are so rich, they'll just ignore that. No, we know that the rich are influenced by prices because in New York, there are many billionaires in New York. They could live in the whole building. They don't. They live in a penthouse on the top of the building. Maybe the penthouse has 30,000 square feet. That's what Trump claimed his apartment had. But probably it has only 10 or 11,000 square feet. That's how much his apartment really does have. But that in New York seems like an enormous space. Why? Because housing prices are so expensive in New York. That's big. Big is a relative concept. And to have big escalate is just wasteful. Everybody likes big. Well, you can have big at one scale, or you can triple everything and it's still just, you have big. That's wasteful. I am a pragmatist. I vote left mostly because I think the inequality issue is the big one, and they've always been the ones who've tackled that most head on. But every policy I recommend, I would defend as being nonpartisan, because if adopted, it would make the pie bigger. And one thing we know is possible is if you can make the economic pie bigger, it's necessarily possible to be able to divide it up so that everybody gets a bigger slice than before. And how could anybody object to that? I mean, if you think that's not a good idea, what, you think people have all the resources they need to pursue their human goals? What an odd thing to believe.
Well, as long as there's more pie involved.
Yeah,
I say yes.
Yeah, well, the numbers are not small. I mean, these arms races waste, by my back of the envelope calculation, $3 trillion a year at least in the US. Probably much more than that, but I could point to evidence that shows it's at least that much. Yeah, that's a huge amount of money.
Thank you for joining us for episode 25 of the Mindful Wealth podcast. We enjoyed this conversation with economist Robert H. Frank so much that we decided we just had to have him back for part 2 in 2 weeks. Thank you and enjoy the episode.